Toronto sits on ground that is not supposed to move. A city built on the Canadian Shield, a slab of ancient, stable Precambrian rock that forms the very core of the North American continent. For decades, it was considered a place immune to the violent geology that terrorizes cities on the Pacific Rim. Solid, unmoving, safe then, at 10:59 p.m. on January 27, 2026, the ground betrayed that promise. A sudden, violent jolt. A low rumble that grew into a definitive shake. Homes trembled from Kitchener to Kingston. More than 2,600 people, startled from their evening routines, reached for their phones and reported the same unbelievable thing. An earthquake in southern Ontario. Have you ever felt the ground shake in a place you thought was perfectly safe? Tell us about it in the comments below. The experience is deeply unsettling. It was not a frost quake, the familiar winter phenomenon where freezing groundwater cracks the soil with a loud bang. It was not construction or a passing train. It was a true tectonic event. A magnitude 3.7 tremor that originated 5 kilometers deep in the Earth's crust. This was a movement of the bedrock itself. The shaking was a warning. And the warning came from a place just miles from the city, a place with a buried, fiercely debated secret. A secret that sits exactly 7 kilometers from one of the oldest nuclear power plants in the world. We spend hundreds of hours researching these hidden stories that affect millions of people. A huge number of you watch and find this work valuable, but a very small percentage actually subscribe. If you believe this kind of deep dive journalism matters, please take 1 second to hit that subscribe button. It is a small click that makes a monumental difference and ensures you never miss an investigation. Now, let's begin. Toronto was never supposed to be an earthquake city. It was built far from the volatile edges of tectonic plates, where continents collide and the Earth's crust is torn apart. The city's geological identity was one of supreme stability, an ancient, quiet foundation. That entire story was thrown into question in 1992. Dr. Arsalan Mohajer, a geologist at the time with the University of Toronto, was exploring the steep, wooded bluffs of the Rouge River Valley, a quiet urban park in the city's eastern suburbs. What he found there should not have existed. Distinct, undeniable fractures in the bedrock. Faults, places where the earth itself had broken and slipped. These were not small, insignificant cracks. At one site, the displacement was measured at 1.25 meters. Solid Ordovician shale, rock that was 450 million years old, had been sheared apart, with one side dropping more than 4 feet relative to the other. And the faults didn't just cut through the bedrock. They continued upward, slicing through the overlying layers of sand and clay left behind by the last ice age. This meant the movement was geologically recent. It had happened after the glaciers retreated. It could happen again. This discovery was an inconvenient truth of the highest order. Because these exposed faults, carved into the riverbank for anyone to see, were located a mere 7 kilometers from the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, Canada's third largest nuclear facility and one of the oldest operating in the world. A collection of massive CANDU reactors sitting right on the shore of Lake Ontario, providing power to millions. A seismic threat next to a nuclear plant is a nightmare scenario, one that the plant's original designers had never been forced to consider. The ground, they assumed, was stable. Dr. Mohajer argued that his findings pointed to only one conclusion: the faults were neotectonic, caused by active, ongoing stresses deep within the North American plate. He believed they were surface expressions of a much larger, deeper fault system, one capable of generating a significant earthquake. An earthquake the Pickering Station was not designed to withstand. He published his findings. He alerted the regulators. He sounded an alarm that echoed through the highest levels of Canada's scientific and nuclear safety establishments. The response was swift, and a furious debate erupted. On the other side was a powerful consensus of geologists, led by prominent figures like Dr. Nick Isles, also from the University of Toronto. They proposed a different, far less terrifying explanation. The faults, they argued, were glaciotectonic. They were not the result of deep Earth movements, but were instead scars left by the last ice age. It is difficult to comprehend the sheer scale of what happened here 10,000 years ago. The Laurentide ice sheet, a glacier more than 2 kilometers thick, covered the entire region. The weight was unimaginable, crushing the bedrock beneath it with immense force. As this colossal sheet of ice advanced and retreated, it didn't just scour the landscape. It pushed, it shoved, it fractured the upper layers of the crust. Dr. Isles and his camp argued the Rouge River faults were nothing more than stretch marks from this ancient glacial abuse. Push, shove features. Inactive relics, geological fossils. They were not connected to any deep, active seismic source. The nuclear plant was safe. So what do you think is more plausible? A hidden, active fault line threatening a major city? Or the colossal, continent-crushing force of a 2-kilometer thick glacier, leaving scars behind? Let me know your initial thoughts in the comments. The debate was not merely academic. The operational future of the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station hung in the balance. If Mohajer was right, the plant might need a multi-billion-dollar seismic refit, or worse, be forced to shut down entirely. If Isles was right, business could continue as usual. In 1999, an expert scientific panel was convened by the regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, to settle the matter. They reviewed the evidence. They heard the arguments from both sides. They concluded that the glaciotectonic theory was the more probable explanation. In 2002, a definitive paper led by geologist Dr. Laurent Godin further solidified this consensus, reinterpreting the features as products of ice deformation. The official story was written. The faults were relics. The threat was neutralized. The science was settled. The regulator was satisfied. The city moved on, and the ground beneath it kept its secrets. The official story was one of safety. The internal planning told a different story. If you dig deep into the open data portals of the Canadian federal government, you find something that most residents of Toronto have never heard of. An official document. A disaster simulation maintained by Natural Resources Canada. It is called the Burlington-Toronto Structural Zone Magnitude 5.0 scenario. It is also referred to as the Rouge Beach scenario. This is not a theoretical exercise. It is a detailed, specific contingency plan. The government, despite publicly accepting the Ice Age scar theory, has a working simulation that calculates the precise damage Toronto would sustain if a moderate magnitude 5.0 earthquake were to strike on this exact fault system. The existence of this scenario is a profound contradiction. It acknowledges a level of risk that the public narrative was designed to dismiss. And here is what makes that scenario so much more frightening than it sounds. An earthquake in Toronto is not like an earthquake in California. The bedrock of the Canadian Shield, the ancient craton on which the city rests, is fundamentally different from the younger, fractured rock of the West Coast. It is colder, denser, harder. When an earthquake happens here, the seismic energy doesn't dissipate quickly. It travels with astonishing efficiency. The old hard rock rings like a bell. A magnitude 3.7 quake, which might only be felt for a few miles in California, was felt across a massive radius of southern Ontario, from Niagara Falls to Kingston. Experts estimate the felt area can be up to 10 times larger for an eastern North American quake compared to a western one of the same magnitude. If this is the first time you are hearing about this official government scenario, do me a favor and hit the like button. And if you have family or friends living in the Greater Toronto area, share this video with them. Public awareness is the first and most critical step in preparing for any risk. So what would that magnitude 5.0 scenario actually look like? The simulation maps out a cascade of potential failures. Toronto is a city of brick. Thousands of older, unreinforced masonry buildings, particularly in neighborhoods like the Annex, Cabbagetown, and Roncesvalles, are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of shaking. A magnitude 5.0 event would not be the big one of Hollywood movies, but it would be strong enough to crack foundations, collapse chimneys, and shatter facades. Infrastructure would be the next victim. The Gardner Expressway, an aging elevated highway that sections of which are already in a state of managed decline, would be under immense stress. Subway tunnels, particularly older sections of the TTC, would need immediate inspection for structural damage, potentially paralyzing the city's transit system for days or weeks. Below ground, the network of water mains and gas lines, some of which are over a century old, would be at high risk of rupture, leading to flooding and fires. The power grid, already strained, could suffer cascading blackouts. And then there is the nuclear elephant in the room. The Pickering Nuclear Generating Station has its own seismic shutdown systems. A magnitude 5.0 quake at its doorstep would trigger an automatic scram, shutting down the reactors. But an emergency shutdown under seismic duress is a high-stress event for any nuclear facility, let alone one of the world's oldest. It puts immense strain on critical safety systems and backup power generators, all while the surrounding region is dealing with its own state of emergency. The government simulation exists because the potential consequences are not trivial. They are city-altering. They plan for the worst case, because in geology, the worst case has a history of arriving unannounced. I know I've asked once before, but the data we have shows that a huge majority of our viewers aren't subscribed. If our work breaking down complex stories like this is something you find valuable, please consider taking a moment to subscribe. It is the single most effective way to support the channel, and it ensures you are the first to know when we release our next investigation. Your support is not just appreciated, it is genuinely essential. The debate over the Rouge River faults may have distracted from a much larger and more ancient truth. The cracks on the surface were just a symptom. The real story lies deeper, much deeper. The entire Great Lakes region is cross-hatched by massive ancient wounds in the Earth's crust. These are not minor fractures. They are profound zones of weakness, known as geological lineaments. Two of them converge directly beneath the Toronto area, the Niagara-Pickering Linear Zone, running under Lake Ontario, and the massive Georgian Bay Linear Zone, which stretches from Georgian Bay all the way down into New York State. These are not scars from the last ice age. They are scars from the birth of the continent itself. Over 1 billion years ago, during a mountain-building event known as the Grenville orogeny, the tectonic plate that would become North America collided violently with other ancient continents. The forces were unimaginable, folding and crushing rock, creating a Himalayan-scale mountain range that has long since eroded away. But the roots of that collision remain. Deep, fundamental faults buried kilometers beneath the surface. For hundreds of millions of years, these faults have been largely dormant, locked inside a stable continental interior. But dormant does not mean dead. The North American continent is under constant, subtle stress. The opening of the Atlantic Ocean is slowly pushing the plate westward from the mid-Atlantic ridge. And for the last 10,000 years, the land itself has been slowly rebounding from the crushing weight of the glaciers, a process called post-glacial rebound. This combination of far field pressure and local uplift can accumulate stress along these ancient billion-year-old zones of weakness. Occasionally, one of them slips, and that is exactly what happened on January 27, 2026. The earthquake's epicenter was not directly on the Rouge River Fault. It was 23 kilometers southeast of Orillia, a city north of Toronto. But its location is no coincidence. It falls directly along the trace of that deeper, more significant Georgian Bay Linear Zone. The 2026 quake was not the Rouge River Fault waking up. It was the ancient architecture of the continent itself groaning under 1 billion years of accumulated stress. Mareike Adams, a seismologist with Natural Resources Canada, was unequivocal. Speaking to the media, she quickly dispelled the idea of a frostquake. This was quite a rare event for this region, she stated, confirming it was caused by internal forces in the Earth. Dr. Robert Sherbakov, an expert in statistical seismology at Western University, put the event in its historical context. He noted that in the past 40 years, there had been only one other probable earthquake above magnitude 2.5 near that specific location, and it was a very small one. The 2026 event was a significant outlier, a statistical anomaly, a geological wake-up call. The scientific argument in the 1990s was a binary choice: active tectonic fault versus inactive glacial scar. The reality, as suggested by the 2026 earthquake, is far more complex. The surface faults in the Rouge Valley could be glacial relics, just as Dr. Isles argued, but they may exist precisely because they sit directly on top of a much larger, deeper, and sporadically active zone of crustal weakness. The glacier may have simply exploited a pre-existing fracture, like a chisel finding a crack in stone. The debate focused on the scratch, while ignoring the deep structural flaw beneath it. This complex reality is often lost in the modern media landscape. In the weeks following the earthquake, sensationalized videos with titles like "A major fault line in Canada just split opened" began to go viral, spreading misinformation and anxiety. They presented a cartoon version of the science, confusing the settled debate about the surface faults with the new questions raised by the deep tectonic tremor. They flattened a complex geological story into simple, terrifying clickbait. The truth is not that a fault split open. The truth is more unsettling. The deep, ancient foundation of the continent is reminding us that it is not entirely asleep. The questions that haunted geologists in the 1990s have not disappeared. They have simply changed form. The central, unavoidable fact remains. One of the world's oldest nuclear power plants sits just 7 kilometers away from a geologically complex and now demonstrably active seismic zone. The Pickering Nuclear Generating Station was designed and built in an era when this level of seismic risk was considered negligible. Every nuclear facility has what is known as a design basis earthquake. The maximum level of shaking it is engineered to safely withstand. For decades, the debate over the Rouge River faults was, at its core, a debate about whether that design basis for Pickering was adequate. Citizen coalitions like the Provincial Council of Women of Ontario have consistently raised this issue for years. During the plant's license renewal hearings before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they have repeatedly cited the original Mohajer fault studies, arguing that the accepted risk models are dangerously optimistic. They contend that the glaciotectonic consensus was a convenient conclusion that allowed the plant's owner, Ontario Power Generation, to avoid costly seismic upgrades. For years, these warnings were dismissed by many as alarmist, fringe concerns. The official science said the plant was safe. Then, on a cold Tuesday night in January, the ground shook. The 2026 earthquake did not damage the plant. It was not nearly strong enough. But it shattered the foundational assumption of a completely quiet geological setting. It proved, in a way no scientific paper ever could, that the bedrock of southern Ontario can and does move. It lends a new, urgent weight to the questions that have been asked for 30 years. Is the design basis earthquake for an aging nuclear plant adequate for a region now known to be seismically active? What happens if the next one is not a magnitude 3.7, but the magnitude 5? Zero that the government's own disaster plan simulates? And this brings everything back to that central, unsettling contradiction. The public story is one of safety and settled science. The internal contingency planning is for moderate disaster. The geological consensus points to inactive surface scars. The recent seismic data points to an active deep crust. Toronto exists in the gap between these two realities. A city of millions, living atop a billion-year-old fracture zone, next to an aging nuclear plant, with an official emergency plan for a disaster that officially shouldn't happen. And for the last time, I promise, if this investigation has given you a new perspective or taught you something you didn't know. Please just take a second to hit that subscribe button. I know, it's the third time, but it's genuinely the only way we can continue funding these deep dives and bringing them to you. Your support makes it all possible. Thank you. The story of Toronto's hidden faults is not yet a cautionary tale. It is something more complicated. A story about scientific uncertainty, corporate liability, and the quiet gamble of urban planning. It's a reminder that our cities are built on a planet that operates on timescales far grander and more violent than our own. We build our homes, our highways, our power plants on a crust that is constantly shifting, breathing, and readjusting under pressures we can barely comprehend. The debate over the Rouge River Valley faults was a question of history, a question of ice versus stone, of ancient glaciers versus hidden tectonic stress. But the shaking felt by thousands of people on January 27th was not a question. It was a statement, a declaration from the deep earth that stability is never permanent. It was a reminder that even the most solid ground